Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the DAS RCN webinar on Seafloor fiber optic sensing. My name is Justin Sweet. I am a project associate with the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology. I'm speaking to you today from the Pascal Instrument Center in beautiful Socorro, New Mexico. IRIS is a consortium of universities and an NSF-funded science facility operating programs that enable Earth scientists to perform advanced research in geophysics, particularly in seismology. This webinar will be recorded and archived on the IRIS Earthquake Science Presentations webinar YouTube channel. Should you have a comment or question as today's webinar unfolds, please clearly and concisely type that into the Q&A box. So you'll be able to find that the Q&A box is one of the buttons on your Zoom control panel near the bottom of your screen. If you move your mouse, that should pop up. Please note that the Q&A box is different from the chat box, so we'd encourage you to please use the Q&A box for putting in questions. At the end of the presentations, I'll go ahead and we've got a series of moderators here too, so we'll be able to review the questions that come in and we can present those, give voice to those to the presenters. And if there are similar questions that have been asked, we may go ahead and combine or skip those. If the webinar happens to crash due to Zoom or internet issues, we'll just go ahead and reboot it. All you need to do is click the same webinar link that you received to log in initially, and that should work fine. Automatic captions are available to be turned on and off, and you can do that on your Zoom control panel. The use of distributed acoustic sensing is rapidly expanding in our community, prompting the initiation of a research coordination network to facilitate workshops, tutorials, and other opportunities for sharing ideas and resources. This is one in a series of webinars on different topics with distributed acoustic sensing. I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to Dr. Nate Lindsey now to get us started.
Cool, thanks, Justin. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nate Lindsey. I'm VP of Science and Innovation at FiberSense. And my co-moderator is Meagan Wengrove, who's an assistant professor at Oregon State University. Meagan and I are part of the Marine Geophysics Working Group, which is part of the NSF-funded DAS Research Coordination Network. The DAS RCN, as it's called, has four main goals: to identify applications in distributed acoustic sensing, train a community, identify needed technical development, both in engineering and in scientific areas, and identify major challenges and next steps for supporting DAS science beyond the RCN. As part of this mission, working groups are located across a broad range of disciplines. The Marine Geophysics Working Group, has met online for the past 2 years and primarily shared research findings within that group. The group is highly diversified with scientists working on instruments, ocean science, solid earth geophysics, and seismology. And today we'll hear from many of these scientists, both working within this group and that this group has identified outside of the working group, but which we wanted to kind of bring together today. So without further ado, I'm excited to just jump in and get off with our next presentation. So our first presentation is going to be by Leah Bouffaut of Cornell University. So Dr. Leah Bouffaut conducted her PhD at the French Naval Academy in underwater acoustics and signal processing. It focused on the detection and classification of blue whale signals recorded by ocean bottom seismometers in the Indian Ocean, and she received her PhD in 2019. During that time, she visited the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at Cornell, where she is currently a postdoctoral associate. She recently completed a 2-year postdoc at NTNU in Norway, where she focused on distributed acoustic sensing and acoustic biologging for baleen whales in the Arctic. Her current research focuses on developing machine learning tools to identify marine mammal vocal activities on both DAS and hydrophone recordings. So take it away, Leah. Thank you.
Thank you, Nate. I hope everyone can hear me correctly. I had to change office between the test and right now. Hope everything is fine. So, okay, let me hide the panels. Yes, and yes, and this. Okay, well, let's just start writing. Thanks a lot for the introduction. So today I'm presenting on behalf of all of my co-authors. Most of them are still at NTNU. And I want to mention that this project and the work I've done on it was funded by ArcX. Well, distributed acoustic sensing for whales. So I thought I would start with a map, which is a very recent map that was published by WWF in a report that is called Protecting Blue Corridors. And what it shows is migratory routes of a lot of different baleen whales and also sperm whales, their migratory route from satellite tracking. And well, I thought it would be a great introduction because it brings me to first, well, mention what is a baleen whale. So baleen whales are large whales that prey on krill and plankton, and they filter out their food from the water using their baleens, as opposite to dolphins that are odontocides and such as sperm whales as well. And so what you can see from this map is that their migratory routes are connecting their breeding and feeding grounds, and they're spread across all oceans. And what we're trying to do is to, well, find those animals and have an idea of their repartition and their distribution across those vast areas and vast oceans. And we're looking for a few number of individuals that are spread all around. And of course, we've been using satellite tracking, for example, but also we've been using passive acoustic monitoring, mostly because, well, most of those species are very loud and vocally active. And the bioacoustic community has been deploying hydrophones all around the oceans. But as you can imagine, it is still fairly expensive to do conservation-specific deployments. And so the data, even though we're collecting more and more, and it is exponentially increasing the quantity of data that we're recording, well, it's still sparse, and we're not yet covering all of their territories. And so this is where I thought, well, where I think and I believe that distributed acoustic sensing can come in play. And here is another map just as a visual aid. This is a representation of all of the fiber optic cables that are crisscrossing at the bottom of our oceans. And well, you can see that there is quite a bit of overlap between those migratory routes and where those fiber optic cables are. And if we could use even a small portion of them to, well, record baleen whales, I think that would be a terrific opportunity. And so the way we can do that, so this is a fairly simple introduction to distributed acoustic sensing. There will be many more detailed talks today, but how does it work? So interrogator is plugged into a fiber optic cable. The one that we used was a dark fiber optic cable, and laser pulses are sent into that fiber. A portion of the energy that is sent is backscattered because of the impurities that are within that fiber. And the interrogator is computing travel time differences between those pulses and converting it into a strain. And so, well, the acoustic sources that are within the ocean are applying strain on the fiber optic cable, and this is what we're measuring. And so this is this little schematic is what we envision, which would be a monitoring system for a lot of different sources that are in the ocean, including ships and whales. Of course, we're not the first one to think about that. And so these are very recent examples. You can see that all of those publications are from 2021, looking at waterborne acoustic sources. And so you can also notice that all of them are anthropogenic, meaning man-made. So there are ships and air guns that have been analyzed by distributed acoustic sensing. And well, we thought if we can monitor ships and we can find air guns, we can likely look at baleen whales as well. So a little bit more about the experiment. So this experiment was conducted in the Svalbard archipelago that is here. So up north, the Atlantic Ocean at the doorstep of the Arctic. It is a very important region because right now it is rapidly changing. We're all aware of climate change. One of the effects is that, well, the oceans are getting warmer and we are facing an atlantification of the Arctic Ocean. And a lot of boreal species are moving poleward, so moving towards the North Pole in that hemisphere. At the same time, the sea ice loss is allowing humans to have more activities, allowing us to have more activities in those areas. And so, for example, in the Barents Sea, there's an increase in the fishery activities and oil and gas exploration. I have a little image that I forgot to click and show about a comparison of sightings of different baleen whale species. So blue whale, minke whale, and fin whale here, just a little bit before 2010 and just after, basically. And you can see the red means that most of the sighting after the change of decade has been made mostly in higher north. So this is kind of corroborating species going poleward. And well, when we think about the change in human activities, one of the examples is the potential of a cross-Arctic shipping route that would go just nearby Svalbard. So let me take you to our field of study, which is at the lower end of that pin, which is called Seafloor. So here it is. So we instrumented a Uninet fiber optic telecommunication cable that is connecting Longyearbyen here up north near Ålesund. In the Longyearbyen, we plugged in Alcatel Optodas interrogator, and so this was conducted during the summer 2020. The sampling frequency was slightly above 600 hertz, and we set it up in a way that the spatial resolution would be 4 meter spacing, meaning that it's like if you would had a hydrophone every 4 meter. We were able to record data over 120 kilometers. And I wanted to mention that this experiment was conducted by the Center of Geophysical Forecasting at NTNU. Well, the first thing that we wanted to analyze was, are we recording any whales? And the short answer is yes. These are a spectrogram representation of some of the signals that we were recording on this fiber optic cable. On the left side, you have the distance along the fiber optic cable where they were recorded. And so for those of you that are not familiar with this representation, we have the time over here and the frequency. So frequency as a function of time. On the first panel, we can see those quite long tonal signal. The entire recording is 150 seconds here. So tonal signals that are fairly low frequency, and those are characteristic of blue whales. Under you have a bunch of down sweeps and up and down sweeps. We didn't go as far as characterization of the species on those because it's actually quite many species can be producing down sweeps, but we could see variations of those signals all over the fiber optic cable. I would like also to notice the the scale that is strain in dB. Now you can hopefully hear the second one that is there. And now the next one, which has a little bit more noise at the beginning. Okay. So we started to analyze this data set as bioacousticians are used to do. So we exported the recordings from every 10 kilometers of this fiber optic cable and visualized them as spectrograms and listened to them and annotated them to have an idea of the signals that we were able to record and to know this data better. We did different classes of annotations, and I will mostly talk about the blue whale stereotype, which was the first image from the last slide, and down sweeps. And so this is the number of calls that we annotated over the entire recording period, which was about 40 days. And so what I think is already interesting is that we can see that the blue whale signals that appear here as blue bars are mostly recorded outside of the fjord. So from the 70 kilometer point and on, while the downsweeps are more inside the fjord. And so what it can already tell us is that there is a difference of use in this very small scale habitat, and either from different species or from different use from the same species of this one habitat. So this is already quite interesting in terms of conservation, but we thought we can probably go deeper. And so what if looking at distributed acoustic sensing data was just a question of representation? So I know geophysicists are very familiar with this representation. The one difference here is that it's moved 90 degrees. So we have the distance over here and the time here. So those are spatiotemporal representation, or TX plots. And we're looking at 130-second recording, and all of this is happening at the same time. And so we can identify 3 areas with some kind of hyperbolas that I will highlight now. And those hyperbolas, what they correspond to is the time of arrival of the signal on each one of those channels of the different sensing point of the fiber optic cable. And so if we look at representation that we know really well to identify those signals, well, here we go. We can find again the tonal signal of the blue whale and a bunch of different downsweeps at those locations. Again, what I think is quite fascinating and that was surprising to me was that, yes, we can have, again, variation along the fiber optic cable. We're able to have a sense of the position of different animals along the fiber optic cable or groups of animal, and we are able to identify them as well. Going a little bit further, I thought, okay, TX plots or the spatiotemporal representation are great, but they do not by themselves help us to identify the species. The way we usually do it is to look at the frequency content of the signal. And so I was thinking of doing some kind of other representation. So on the left side, you have distance versus frequency representation, a spatial spectral representation. And so on the right side is the way I computed it. So what I did is that I took every 2 seconds of signal and computed the fast Fourier transform on it. And so you will see an animation of that, where you can see a very narrowband signal that is coming over there, while the downsweep are quite clear between at 40 and 50 something kilometer. And so this helps us. And so here you have a full snapshot of this one animation. And so we see this very clearly at the 3 different locations. And so this can help us characterize the different species that are recorded on this one portion of observation. We can also zoom in a little bit. And I wanted to show that because I know it's quite interesting to look at interference patterns as well. And so this is the one downsweep that does have a lot of interferences. So I thought I would play a little closer, have a closer look at it. So yeah, so we can clearly identify the 3 different whales that are recorded along the fiber optic cable. So then we thought we can go even further and do localization. And the way we tackled that issue was a very rudimentary way. So we're comparing theoretical and measured time difference of arrivals. And the theoretical one is computed according to the bathymetry. We have a source depth that is placed at 30 meters. We consider a constant sound speed. And basically what we're going to do is to do a grid search for different offsets and closest channels. The measured time difference of arrival is estimated on the 5-second signal window. It is bandpass filtered, and we estimate the time difference of arrival by cross correlation between the different channels. And so we compare the theoretical and the measured one and try to optimize the problem. And this is again done by cross correlation to estimate the closest channel. And then we try to minimize the root mean square error to estimate the range. To calibrate the method, because, well, we don't really know exactly where the whales are. So to calibrate the method, we used ship signals and IAS, so their positioning system. So on the top, we have again a few TX plots along the crossing of a ship that is crossing the fiber optic cable at about 96.5 kilometers. And this is the way we calibrated. And so this results, and the discussion about it is available as a preprint and is right now under review. We applied the same thing to a whale. And so this is showing some example of the near field localization. So the blue dots are the measured time difference of arrival, and the red line is the theoretical best match. the few values that you have around. Up there is the estimated range. You have the correlation coefficient between the blue dots and the red line. The yellow line is the closest channel. And well, this is just to have an idea of where we are in time in that, the one example I will show you after. Present after. And so these are successive localization points. And we kept only values that are in green. And so values where the correlation coefficient is higher than 90%. I did a little check, and basically everything that was below 90% was related to noise, while everything that was above, this is information from the annotation, were actually corresponding to whale call. And so here are the results. Again, TX plot, so distance here, we are quite far out in the open ocean. So we have the closest channel that is highlighted in white. And under it, we have the beamformed and or stacked signal. Here is the spectrogram representation, and here is the waveform. And so this for successive example, again, it's the same whale moving along, but just for visualization, I cut out the noise portions of it so we could have it all in one slide. And we will be able to listen to that one that is here. Yes. The low frequency part. Okay, so it might, I don't know how if you hear it really well, but it might not be, sorry for that. It might not be the best from the loudspeaker of the computer because they're very low frequency, but the beamforming increased the quality by a lot. And this is the last one bit of analysis that we've done on those signals. And we were inspired by this wonderful paper that is over there. So seismic cross-whale imaging using fin whale song. As you might know, fin whale song is very repetitive and in a way quite similar to airgun signals. And so this, the idea that was, continued on that paper is to, well, track the fin whales, use their song as sources of opportunities to do cross-whale imaging. What we thought is that, well, we might not have an extremely good track because we don't have so many signals, but we do have a lot of sensors. So what if we were at least comparing one signal recorded outside, so which would be on the left, and inside on the right of the fjord, and looking at what we receive on all of the DAS receivers. And so we can analyze it a little further. And so what we understood is that the red line is the waterborne direct and multiple arrivals, but you also see this orange line. And so the little sketches that we see in the left top hand corner are the way we envisioned it and understood it. And so what we can see between those two different locations is that there is a subsurface layer that is thicker inside the fjord than outside, which is already something interesting to look at. All of the results that I presented today are available in our Earth Archivics preprint and are right now under review with Frontiers in Marine Science. And the data is as well open source and available, not all of the data, but the whale examples. So distributed acoustic sensing enables whales and dolphin monitoring in their environment potentially in real time and at scales that I believe are completely unprecedented, both in terms of spatial resolution and, well, the spatial scale. And so what is next to go towards biology conservation and studying ecology of whale in their habitats? Well, first, I think, and which I think is great, is that fiber optic cable are available all around the world. And DAS allows acoustic recording at minimal operational cost, and we have the potential for real-time processing, which could be critical in crucial areas for whales. And there are many, many different engineering key steps that we need to take. One of them is one I really want to mention today, is the question of calibration of the signal. a lot of passive acoustic monitoring application, and especially the topic of density estimation of animals requires heavy statistics, but it requires us to know really well how well are we receiving the signals. And we know that this varies along the fiber optic cable. And so I really believe that calibration is the next step. Yes, and I would like to thank you all, and I would be happy to take questions.
Great, Leah. Thanks a lot. That was a wonderful talk. There's a bunch of questions in the Q&A. Please drop your questions into the Q&A instead of the chat if you can, as they come in. So I guess just kind of jumping in, there's a couple questions about the method, like the range of the DAS system you mentioned was 120 kilometers. So there's a question of if that's one DAS or two DASs from either, one from either side.
So that was one DAS that was in the land side of Longyearbyen. I know that the Norwegian team is planning this summer to put DAS on the other side to instrument the entire fiber optic cable, but the 120 kilometers were from one only.
Yeah, great.
Yes.
Another question about the spatial resolution and gauge length and kind of sampling interval.
Yeah. So so the spatial interval was 4 meters, the gauge length was 6 meters, and the sampling frequency was 630 hertz, or maybe 32. I'm not certain right now, but so we had about a 300 hertz bandwidth.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. I guess one question I had, and it came up from Robert Elwood too, is the directionality of the sensor, because it's a horizontal sensor and really directionally sensitive. So do you think that you see kind of whales that are further up fiber, or do you see them as they're right above due to amplitude differences, or what do you think on that?
So from the observation I had from the data, where we definitely see a notch from the closest channel, which actually gives us a little bit of information about where is the whale, because then look for the absence of data in a way. But so I think the whale doesn't necessarily have to be far away, because well, you receive the signal over 10 kilometers, so you would receive it at other locations. I think this would be quite dependent, which is also what I meant by we need better understanding of the calibration of the signal, is that this might be dependent on the water depth as well, of the trenching and of the fiber that is used as well. So, and to me, that's one of the key steps to go forward with this technology and use it for passive acoustic monitoring of whales. Yeah,
that's very cool. I think there's kind of an interest to maybe know exactly where the whale was. Like maybe you could use tagging or something to track exactly where the whale was in proximity.
This is
the
kind
fiber
of
in the
dream.
future. Yeah, great.
Yep.
So I guess just maybe I'm just gonna pick out one more. Are you sure the cable measures strain? This last question from Luis Matias. DAS is not a set of hydrophones as mentioned exactly. So are you sure that the cable's measuring strain? Fibers are known to be sensitive to pressure also.
That's an excellent question, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer it, which I believe, again, calibration might give us the answers to that, but yeah, I wouldn't know a lot more about it.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's probably going to be a theme for for the decade of DAS.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Leah. There's a number of questions. If you can just go through in the Q&A as a panelist and kind of answer them in text, that'd be excellent.
Yes.
And I'm going to turn it over to Meagan to introduce our next set of speakers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Leah. So our next set of speakers are Ethan Williams from CalTech and Dr. William Wilcock from the University of Washington. And they're going to be talking to us about a community test of DAS and DTS on the Ocean Observatories Initiative Regional Cabled Array. Ethan Williams is a PhD candidate in geophysics at the Seismological Laboratory of the California Institute of Technology, working with Professor Zhongwen Zhang. His research focuses on novel applications of distributed acoustic sensing and passive seismic data for environmental and engineering geophysics. Recent projects include shear wave velocity profiling for near surface characterization using passive DAS recordings at the ocean bottom and in urban environments, extending the theory of seismic interferometry to ocean waves in order to map ocean currents in high resolution, and analyzing the changes in the apparent frequencies of 9-story reinforced concrete building from 20 years of ambient vibration data. Dr. William Wilcock is a marine geophysicist at the School of Oceanography at University of Washington, where he has been for 29 years. His primary research expertise is in seismic studies of submarine volcanoes, both studying earthquakes and seismic structure. He has additional interest in developing instrumentation for seafloor geodesy, seafloor cabled observatories, and the opportunistic use of ocean bottom seismometer data for studying baleen whales. He is also involved in efforts to promote offshore observations in the Pacific Northwest to provide improved early warning for earthquake and tsunamis on the Cascadia subduction zone. So with that, Ethan and William, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. I will get the presentation going. So is that visible?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is going to be a tag team presentation between Ethan and myself. I'm going to start by giving some information about the genesis of this experiment. And then Ethan's going to get into the details of the experiment, and then I will conclude by presenting some very preliminary analysis of whale signals that will complement what Leah showed us. For people who are not aware, the NSF operates a pretty sophisticated regional cabled observatory that extends off Pacific City, Oregon, with 2 cables, one of which goes out to axial seamount on the Juan de Fuca Ridge, and the other one which wraps around to the south and then comes up onto the continental slope and shelf of Newport, Oregon. And these provide power and communications to a variety of instruments for essentially a permanent observatory. And the communications is provided through a twisted pair of fibers in each of the 2 cables, which supports the internet communications. And I think from early on in DAS, people started asking questions about whether a DAS experiment could be done on this. I first became aware of it at the SSA meeting in Seattle in 2019, when various people asked me whether an experiment could be done on this cable. I'm not actually part of the group. The UW operates the cable, but I'm not actually part of the group that does that. But it rapidly became apparent that the challenge was they never shut this system down except when it breaks down. So it was difficult to find a time when there was a scheduled maintenance. But in early 2020, they did learn that there were plans to do some work on the power systems. So we started planning a short experiment. And one of the challenges of working in the Northeast Pacific Ocean is everything needs to go through the Navy, who were concerned about recording signals of interest. But we went through the process of getting permission from the Navy, and we're planning an experiment in November 2020, and then COVID got in the way and we couldn't do it. We tried to do it again in the summer of 2021, but that proved infeasible because of the workload of the team that actually does the maintenance cruises for the cabled observatory. So then we finally did it in November of 2021, and the data was released a couple of months later after the Navy had screened it. The goals of the experiment were to collect, an offshore data set that would be available to the entire community. We wanted to actually go through the process of Navy screening, which will probably going to be required for federally funded experiments in sensitive areas, so that was an established process that future experiments could do. And then there's a whole variety of potential applications from imaging the shallow subsurface structure, recording earthquakes, looking at oceanographic signals and acoustic signals from whales and ships, and probably other things that I'm unaware of. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ethan to actually describe the experiment.
So William showed the RCA cable diagram that shows these multi-100-kilometer cables heading out to axial seamount and hydrate ridge. But in reality, we're limited by the sensing range of DAS because the repeaters along the cable path, which are used to amplify the internet communications during the normal operation of the cabled array, are opaque to the lasers in the DAS systems. So you can see here kind of a 3D slice of the Oregon margin, and the north cable is the short cable. It goes down to 65 kilometers depth before it hits the first repeater, and so that's the maximum sensing range for this experiment. And the south cable, which is the long cable, goes down to a maximum range of about 1,600 meters depth. And this depth range and repeater range is relatively significant relative to the seismological goals of the experiment because it crosses several of the 4-arc faults that have been mapped by the USGS in high resolution in Cascadia. But unfortunately, neither cable makes it all the way to the Cascadia Trench, but comes relatively close. The cables are continuously buried, which is quite unusual relative to typical telecom cables up to the first repeater, so all the way out to 95 kilometers on the south cable. And nominally, the depth of that burial is 5 feet, but that's not been mapped in detail, and so it may vary. Next slide, please. And so if you look at these at map view, you can see the relationship between them. Particularly, they run pretty much exactly parallel out through the surf zone and down the shelf. And then once they reach about 200 to 300 meters water depth, they start to diverge and are separated as they pass around topography. And the curvature that they follow around topography means that there are orthogonal cable segments or approximately orthogonal cable segments that may be very useful for locating earthquakes or acoustic signals because they give a kind of miniature array geometry. It also might be possible to do things like cross-correlate among cables because they're sufficiently separated at the further offshore limit. Next slide, please. So we acquired data in the very beginning of November 2021. It's a 4-day data set with a slight addendum of 8 hours of configuration tests. The shore city in Pacific Oregon is about 2 kilometers from the location where the cable reaches the beach. So the cable just runs under the road for those 2 kilometers and then goes down into a manhole where it is in a bored conduit out to a further depth. And in this shore station, which is just used for ordinary sorts of telecom operations, we set up 2 systems inside, 2 OptiSense Quantex interrogator systems. And then due to COVID restrictions and safety, we set up 2 Silixa systems, an Ultima DTS and a IDAS V3 outside in RVs, and used, you can see on the far right of that top left image, 100-meter patch cables to patch them into the OI system inside. Next slide, please. And so just to get into the nitty-gritty of the data set, because some of you are probably going to want to look at this and use it, we have 4 total fibers. As William mentioned, there's a transmit fiber and a receive fiber twisted together within each cable, which ordinarily act as a communications pair, but there are no additional backup fibers. So this is our maximum number of fibers. And we utilized all 4 of them with 4 instruments. And so each cable had an OptiSense Quantex DAS on it, provided by CalTech. And then there was a DTS on one cable in the second fiber and a second DAS and a Silixa system on the other cable during the fiber. And we varied the acquisition parameters with the goal of being able to, 1, have a data set that people could explore in terms of looking at high frequency acoustic signals and low frequency seismic and oceanographic signals with relative ease. Also to have a data set which was relatively continuous so that there weren't processing difficulties by people who wanted to do things that involved time-lapse analysis. And also varying the parameters so that we could really understand what was optimal for this sort of configuration in this cable in this environment, with the eye towards future potential tests here. So the north cable OptiSense system reached all the way out to the repeater at 65 kilometers. It hit a hard end in the reflection. And we varied this system over the few days. So we went up to 1,000 hertz for one day and down to 200 hertz on the last day, with 1,000 hertz being potentially a better signal for recording vocalizations. On this north cable, we also recorded with DTS. The DTS is a nominal range of 30.4 kilometers and a sampling rate of 900 seconds. However, we're not sure how good this data really is. There's some relatively strong reflections at splice points, like in the beach manhole, and it may not be the best data, but it's at least a good comparison and a benchmark for what ordinary telecom single mode data is going to look like with GTS. Next slide, please. And then for the south cable, we had another Quantex system, which also nominally integrated out to 95 kilometers, which is the maximum range of the south cable before the first repeater. However, the data quality does start to degrade towards the last 15 kilometers or so, just due to transmission losses. We kept this recording continuously at the exact same sampling for the entire recording duration. The received fiber then had the SLIX IDAS v3, and this one also could kind of nominally see to the end of the fiber, but they decided to cut the recording at 80 kilometers, where they started to have a drop in SNR. And then they also, on days 3 and 4, increased their recording rate. So we have 1,000 hertz data from the first day and the last day, if people are interested in that, with different gauge length settings. The one thing to note is we also swapped these. So there's, if you go into the FTP that I'll talk about, there's a folder that shows a few hours of data where we swapped the transmitted and received fibers. And so you can actually see that there are differences between them. And so in future experiment planning, and also if you're picking which data set to look at, you may want to do that sort of comparison first. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, William will show some great examples of fin whale calls and blue whale calls, but here's just a quick overview of the kinds of signals you'll see. On the left is what the unfiltered data looks like in shallow water. It's absolutely dominated by ocean surface gravity waves. And you can see here over this 2-kilometer distance, the shoaling behavior in shallow water as they get slower and slower as they propagate into shallower and shallower water. In deep water, there's extremely coherent ambient seismic noise over the complete depth range of these data sets. It's dominantly around 0.05 to 1 hertz as is observed globally. And it's dominated by surface wave components, and it's relatively diffuse. You can see it propagating in both directions. Next slide, please. If we go to high frequencies, there are also fin whale and a couple blue whale vocalizations, which are very clear, and William will talk about. And there are some earthquake T phases, and frankly, we only saw a few of them going by. The data set hasn't been mined for these. There may be more. Some of the ones that we saw and took screenshots of and then went back to find are not clear cataloged events. So they may originate from minor Gorda plate type seismicity near the cable. Or they may be teleseismic. It's kind of an open question. So a great opportunity to look at those. And one more slide. And we did record 2 regional earthquakes. Though the data quality isn't great, it may be a good first test for understanding what earthquake recording sensitivity is going to be like on these shallow coastal cables in Cascadia for potential earthquake early warning integration. There's a magnitude 4.4 near Petrolia, which is about 500 kilometers away, and a magnitude 4.1 about the same distance in the Bartlett Springs fault system. And if you look at the data without applying any kind of spatial filtering, you can see this at higher frequencies on the deep water segment of the cable. But applying some sorts of like FK filtering, you can start to pull it out in areas where the environmental noise is stronger. So those are available in this data set as well. Next slide, please. So that was a quick showcase of what we collected and what's in the data. If you want to look at this yourself, there's an experiment landing page which has some information about contacts and whatnot, but there's also just a direct FTP server. So you can go in, and it's shown on the top right, find the cable you want, find the fiber you want, find the experiment configuration you want, and download individual data files. So if you just want to have a root around and see what ocean bottom DAS data looks like, this is a really easy way to do that. If you want to download more of the data, the full data set is 26 terabytes. And so you need to send hard drives to OOI for copy, which is possible, and the directions are given on the website. There's also some documentation. So there's a README file that gives details about the experiment design and data formats. There's metadata like the fiber location and fiber water depths. And I also, at least for the OptiSense data, which is on both fibers, I put together a short notebook that introduces their H5 data format and shows how to read and visualize some of the signals. I think William, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So we were, as Ethan said, we've recorded a lot of whales. One of the advantages of doing the experiment in November is it's the sort of peak calling time for fin and blue whales. And this is just one example. I'm showing channel number. The channel spacing is 2 meters. And you can see these signals here. These are fin whale calls. And so time's increasing upwards. So the closest approach to the cable is the lowest point. And then you can see them propagating about 30, 40 kilometers offshore and 20 kilometers inshore. Interestingly, this fin whale is right at the shelf break where I think marine biologists would expect a lot of whales to congregate. And these fin whales have these incredibly repetitive calls. I'm just showing intensity. They're about a second long, 20 hertz, swept down slightly in frequency. And during the mating season, individuals will go on doing this for hours. And so they are incredible sources. We haven't started trying to utilize the fact we have a large number of channels to stack the data or to increase signal to noise. But Brad Lipovsky suggested the idea of just applying an FK filter to eliminate all signals that are propagating at velocities less than 1.5 kilometers per second down the cable. And that does enhance the signal to noise quite substantially. Just zoom in on this, you can see a lot of detail and in terms of the signal intensity of the signal that's recorded from the fin whale. And this presumably reflects both complex propagation in shallow water and potentially different properties of the cables as you move along it. We've only looked really in detail at the OptiSense data for this, but the Selixa data also recorded fin whales, and these are some plots that were made during the experiment. And this is just the top left-hand corner is just an example of the fin whale 20 hertz chirp recorded on one channel. The right-hand plot just shows very similar to some plot that Leah shows, showing actual waveforms. And you can see when the animal's right overhead the cable, the amplitudes are lower because the arrivals arriving perpendicular to the cable, so the strain signal along the cable will be fairly small. And then the lower left-hand plot is just a spectrogram showing that there are actually 2 different frequencies, and this is quite common. Some of the fin whales sing with a doublet song, which has notes of slightly different frequencies. Blue whales are also very vocal animals, but there's not as many of them in the Northeast Pacific, but we did record blue whale calls. And this is an example of a blue whale A call, and it's actually overlain by some fin whale calls. You can see it extending out to the left-hand side. And we can zoom in and look at this in a little more detail. And this is basically a pulse call. It lasts for about 10 to 20 seconds with pulses about every second. They are about allowed. Blue whales are about the same as loud as fin whales, so it's somewhat puzzling that these only propagate maybe about 10 kilometers along the cable. But that may be because of the frequency content. They're at about 16 hertz, but they have a lot of energy and harmonics. Or it may be something to do with the depth they're calling. There's another kind of call, actually the loudest blue whale call is the B call. And that's shown here, again, overlain by some fin whale calls, and we can zoom in on that. And again, see a lot of quite complex structure. And again, it's visible out to about 10 kilometers from the nearest approach to the cable. We can look at a spectrogram of the blue whale calls, and that's shown here. And the call is about 16 hertz or slightly lower, but there are harmonics. And for many blue whales, it depends on the animal, but very often the third harmonic is as loud as the primary call. So the third harmonic about 48 hertz. Here it isn't, and that may just reflect the gauge length. This is data recorded with a 50-meter gauge length. And so that might be decreasing the amplitude of these higher frequency calls. there are days when or times when you just see multiple whales recording at once, and this is just showing both cables, and a total of 5 vocalizing whales are visible. And just so very quickly, you can go ahead and sort of pick the arrival times, which I think I did in red, and then just sort of with a constant velocity try to locate the animals. And this shows just one example of being able to locate 5 fin whales at once. And you can see that most of them are pretty close to one of the cables, but one of them were clearly recorded on both cables. So I think it will be interesting to figure out what the sensitivity is to these acoustic signals as a function of position relative to the cable. And this is sort of the sort of gee whiz thing, just showing you can track them. And basically just locating fin whales 30 minutes apart. And so I think there'll be a lot of interest, at least for me, to be able to sort of track these animals and trying to study some of their behavior. So in terms of what's next, well, I think it's really important to get more open access offshore data. And so I really do encourage people to go and explore this data set. There is a mailing list. I haven't sent any messages to it. I don't know when anybody's joined it, but I think it would really be good to try and coordinate the analysis and have people communicate. And the final thing is that the OI cabled array hopefully won't shut down very often, but I think the technology is either here or will soon be here to operate DAS on lit fibers. And the OI system was designed with spare communication frequency bands to enable expansion of the cabled observatory. So I think there is a potential to have permanent DAS on the OI cabled array if that's viewed as being useful for the community. Thank you.
Thank you, William and Ethan. There are some questions that have come in the Q&A. The first question is, what's the difference in your results with the different sampling frequencies you used? Or in other terms, did you see more whale signals with 1000 hertz, 500 hertz, or 200 hertz?
And the answer to that is we only got the data about a few weeks ago, so we haven't looked. I just rushed to get the presentation out on the whales for a conference on marine mammals that was held in Hawaii in March. So those are all interesting questions.
Another question is, how do you know that the signal is from a blue whale or a fin whale? Like what's the characteristic that you can identify to identify the whales?
They have stereotype calls, so they have very consistent calls. So fin whales have these 1-second chirps at about 20 hertz, and the Northeast Pacific blue whale has several calls, including the A and B call, which are at about sort of 14 to 16 hertz. And so I guess the people who figured that out were people who went out and observed whales at the same times as they recorded them.
How did you do the localization relative to a single line? Isn't the position non-unique? Like, could it be coming from either side of the cable? Well, there's two things. We have two cables, so most of the whales are recorded on both cables, and the cables are quite strongly curved. So along most of their length, there isn't that ambiguity. But I suspect, if whales are just recorded on one cable in certain positions, there may be an ambiguity. Do you see ocean surface reflections in the whale calls? Yes, you can see on some of them. In deeper water, you get these clear, for the fin whale calls in particular, you get multipaths, which have one or more reverberations in the water column. In the shallower water, it's more common, it's more complex because you basically have modes. But in the deeper water path, we certainly do see multipaths in the data. And then another question that came to the mind of myself and Nate is, what were the lessons learned from the Navy screening? And are there best practices that could be used for future experiments?
Well, I think one really interesting thing about this data set is it was extremely hard to see ships, which are about as loud or maybe even a little louder than fin and blue whales. And we were looking at AIS, and when they came over the instruments, there were Navy screeners present, and they were kind of excited and looking at the data that we saw on the waterfall plots and then looking at it in the back room. And I think they were, I don't know whether disappointed or pleased that it was hard to see ships. It took the Navy, the 6-7 weeks to screen the data, and they released the full data set. So that tells us that not all of this data is going to be embargoed, but I don't really have information about, how big a concern DAS data is to the Navy. But it's likely to be, in the Northeast Pacific, as you get close to the entry to Puget Sound and Southern California, there are, a lot of submarine observations. So those are the areas where it's likely to be of most concern. But the other thing I should say is the Navy has been very good with all seismic experiments at their expense, screening data and getting it into the hands of the community.
That's great. Okay, I think there's just a couple other questions in the chat, but we can, Nate, if you want to take it over for the. Thanks, William and Ethan. Great job.
It was very good. So I want to encourage everyone to definitely dig into these data sets. Both of our presenters so far have basically released data that's available to dig into. Our next presentation is going to be by Han Xiao of University of California, Santa Barbara. Han is a fourth-year PhD candidate in geophysics at the University of Santa Barbara, working with Professor Toshiro Tanimoto. He received his BS in geophysics from the Ocean University of China and a master's degree from Tongji University in Shanghai. His research is focused on seismic noise, especially microseisms, which is what I'll be talking about today. Currently, Han uses the latest distributed acoustic sensing data to study the sources and generation mechanisms of microseisms. He's expected to complete his doctoral dissertation this summer. So Han, without further ado, take it over.
Okay. So I'm gonna share my screen. Oh, thank you, Nate.
Yeah, great. Looks good.
So yeah, thank you. So hello everyone. I'm very happy to share our research on DAS. So our research is on locating the precise sources of high-frequency microseismics using DAS. So I did this research with my advisor Toshiro Tanimoto and Professor Zach Speckle from the University of Michigan and all the other co-authors. So regarding this presentation, I mainly have 3 parts, because some of you may be not familiar with the microseismics. So for the first part, I will briefly describe what microseismics are. And on the second part, I will show some data example of microseismics on DAS. So for the last part, I will describe how can we locate the precise sources of the microseismics using DAS for the first time. So the first part, what are the microseismics? Actually, microseismics is a kind of ambient noise that can be observed everywhere on Earth. So the dominant frequency you can see is about 0.05 to 2 Hertz. We can see the primary microseismics here, or the secondary microseismics here. Actually, the microseismics was discovered more than 100 years ago, like by Richard in 1904. About 70 years ago, Lundin Higgins and Hasselmann established a theory of the microseismic generation mechanism. For the primary microseismics, it generated by the direct coupling between the ocean wave and the solid Earth. For the secondary microseismics, it required the interactions of the ocean waves that propagating in the opposite direction and generated the pressure on the sea bottom. So actually, studying microseismics has many uses. Like we can have a better understanding of the underground structure, either by this ambient noise surface wave tomography or the body wave cross correlations. But the problem is that we don't know the sources of the microseismic noise. So you can see that this microseismic seismogram. It's a continual noise. It's unlike the earthquake, which have a clear peak that we can use to locate the epicenter. So really hard to find the sources of the microseismics. For the surface wave microseismics, we can only know a roughly directions by using some techniques like polarization analysis and beamforming. So you can see all those stations pointing at the ocean, but we know the noise is generated at the ocean, in the ocean, but we don't know where it is. So even with the OBS ocean bottom seismometer, we can only know a roughly direction. We just guess. We just guess where the source it is. Like we never know the exact sources of the microseismics. So of course the microseismics also contain the body wave. So using like really dense seismic array online, and also back projection techniques, we can know roughly locations of the microseismic body waves. But the positioning area is hundreds of kilometers because using back projection, it depends on the location, the precise location depends on the velocity model we use. Usually we use the velocity model AQ135 or Pierre model, so we can never get the precise source locations. So here I used a really dense array in South China. This array contains like 350 seismometers, and I use this array to locate the P wave and S wave microseismic in East Australia. I know even after the corrections from the earthquakes, the positioning area is hundreds of kilometers. So for now, the problem is that we never know the exactly sources of the microseismics. But DAS is a game changer for the research on microseismics. So for the second part, I will show some data example of microseismics on DAS. So here is the fiber we are using. So this fiber is in the Mediterranean coast of Spain. So it's about 50 kilometers long, and but only 41 kilometers is under the seabed. So the buried depth is around 1 meter. Sampling rate is 1,000 hertz, and the channel spacing is 16 point meters. In all, we have about 3,000 channels, and we have about 8 days data. So, but here, the good thing here is we have really good wave model and wind model here, which are pretty important for us to study the microseismic generation. So here are the data example. So we can see from the spectrum, we can see there are mainly 2 peaks. The first peak is around 0.02 to 0.2 hertz, and we know it's a ocean surface gravity wave because its amplitude decrease with the depth. And also can see another peak at in the frequency band 0.5 to 1 hertz. We know it's microseismic. So if we check the route map of the ocean waves, you can see here, the dominant frequency of the ocean waves propagating in the opposite direction is around like orange. I mean, for the orange color is around 2 seconds to 4 seconds, or 0.25 to 0.5 hertz. So after wave interaction, the microseismic in the frequency band 0.5 to 1 hertz will be generated. So we can see from the string rate data, we can clearly see the microseismic noise. You can see the noise is propagating to land or to the deep sea with a speed around 500 meters to 1,000 meters per second. So from the FK beamforming, we can see for the frequency band 0.02 to 0.2 hertz, the speed of signal is around 10 meters per second. So that's why we know it's a surface, ocean surface gravity wave, because the speed is the ocean wave speed. And we can see that clearly incoming wave and reflection wave. But for the noise in the fixed band higher than 0.2 Hertz, we can see the speed of the signal is around hundreds of meters per second to thousands meters per second. So we know it's a seismic wave. But previous study think it's shorty wave. We want to confirm from the theory that it is shorty wave. So we calculate the excitation mode of the wave-wave interactions of the ocean wave. So here is the velocity model we use. The first layer is sedimentary layer and a transition layer connecting to the prime model. So we can clearly see the shorty wave mode here, and we can see the tsunami mode here, and this is the first overtone and second overtone, third overtone. So we know it's a shorty wave mode, shorty wave. And then this figure, the phase velocity is plotted against the frequency. So the x-axis here is the frequency. The y-axis here is the phase velocity. So we can see the tsunami mode is actually in very low frequency. And we can see here is the shorty wave mode, and the first overtone, second overtone, sorry. And so we can see the shorty wave we got from the theoretical calculation is very similar to what we got from the beamforming result of the dust data. So it supports that we mainly observe are the effects of the shorty wave. So, and also we calculate the engine functions of the shorty wave mode. You can see the up left here is the shorty wave mode, and this one is the first overtone and second overtone, third overtone. So you can see the engine functions of the shorty wave are basically very similar to those of the relay waves online, but it has the largest amplitude as the sea bottom. So the red dashed line here is the ocean bottom. So basically it's the fundamental mode of the relay wave, but it's because it has the largest amplitude as the sea bottom, so we can call it shorty wave. So now we know it's a shorty wave. And then the next one is how can we locate the precise sources of microseisms using dust? So actually we use cross correlations. So we cross correlate different channels every 1.5 kilometers. So for example, this cross correlation result near the coast. We can see from the cross correlation result, we can know the wave propagation directions. For example, for the signal from the negative part of the cross correlation here is the seismic noise propagating to the land. For the signal of the positive part is the seismic noise propagating to the ocean. But most importantly, we can see the 10 minutes result is similar, very similar to the 6 days stacked result. So that means the noise is actually parallel to the cable. So that's why even with the straight line fiber, we don't have a special resolution for the seismic wave perpendicular to the fiber. We can still locate the sources of microseismic because we know the noise we got from dust is actually parallel to the fiber. So we can that's why we can locate the sources. So and then we do the cross correlation for all the channels every 1.5 kilometers. Here is another example in the deep sea. We can see the noise. We can see clearly noise propagating to the ocean world, but there is no noise propagating to the landward. You can see the 10 minutes cross correlation function is very similar to 6 days cross correlation function, except the noise. I mean, here, the noise level is much higher than the 6 days cross correlation function. So, and then for each 10 minutes data, we cross correlate all the channels every 1.5 kilometers. And then we calculate the signal to noise ratio for both landward and seaward propagation. So here are all the results. So each line is actually 10 minutes result. So the blue line is the seismic noise propagating to the ocean. The pink line is the seismic noise propagating to the deep sea. So, propagating to the land, sorry. So you can see from 0 to 7 kilometers, we can see there is no seismic noise propagating to the deep sea. But beyond 27 kilometers, there is no seismic noise propagating to the land. But we know if the seismic noise should propagate the seismic wave in all directions. That's why we think the noise sources should be in between, because here the seismic noise propagating both landward and seaward. So we know for now we roughly know the sources should be roughly in between 7 to 27 kilometers, and the ocean depth here is about 25 to 100 meters. So the next question is why the sources can be generated at this depth. So we calculate the excitation coefficients of the wave-wave interaction for the shorter wave mode. So you can see the red line is a shorter wave mode, and the black line is the first overtone and second overtone and third overtone. So you can see at the depth of 100 meters, the shorter wave mode, the excitation coefficient of the shorter wave mode is pretty high, in the frequency band 0.5 to 2 hertz. But here is the result for the different depths. You can see with the ocean depths become deeper, like 200 meters, 300 meters, and 500 meters, the excitation coefficients become much smaller. But for the result at the depths of 25 meters, 65 meters, and 100 meters, the results are pretty similar. So that's why we can get the seismic noise in the frequency band 0.5 to 2 hertz. So this is consistent with our observation. So now we can understand why the noise can be generated at this depth. So the next step is we want to know the precise source location of Microseisms. So we plot the signal to noise ratio as a function of time for both oceanward and landward propagating, seismic wave propagating. So the x-axis here is the time. The y-axis here is the distance from the coast. You can see here is 10 kilometer, here is 25 kilometer, and here is 10 kilometer and 25 kilometers. You can see the seismic noise propagates either to at a particular time, either to the oceanward, or to the landward, or to the oceanward. That means you can see here we can only get the seismic noise propagating to the land, but here we can only get the seismic noise propagating to the ocean. So why? So we think it's because at each particular time the noise sources is pretty narrow. For example, if the noise sources is here at 25 kilometers, we can only get the seismic noise propagating to the land. If the seismic noise is here, we can only get at the 10 kilometers here, we can only get the seismic noise propagating to the ocean. If the seismic noise in between, like here, we can get the seismic noise propagating both to landward and seaward. So now we know the seismic noise sources is actually in between those two colors, like between the landward and seaward propagation. So we put those two figures into one figure, so we can see the sources more clearly. The sources is actually in between, and it's constantly changing. So the figure below is actually the source regions where the signal to noise ratio for both landward and seaward are larger than 5. So we can see the noise sources area that we can never get from the traditional seismometers. And so this is 4.5 to 1 hertz. And for 1 to 2 hertz, the noise sources are pretty similar with 0.5 to 1 hertz. So the next question is why the noise sources is constantly changing. So we think it's because of local wind directions. So the black line here is the wind direction from 0 degree to 360 degrees. You can see the noise sources in between those two colors are constantly changing with the wind direction. We think this is because when the wind direction changes, the locations of the wave interactions will also be changed. That's why the sources of microseisms will be changed. So yeah, here are the conclusions. So first, with only 10 minutes data, we can get a stable cross-correlation function. And with that, we get precise microseismic sources that we can never get before. And last one, the sources of the high-frequency microseismics are constantly changing with the wind direction. So that's all. Thank you for your listening. I'm very happy to have any questions.
Thanks a lot, Han. That was excellent.
Yeah.
We have one question already come in. Please drop your questions into the Q&A if you have any. Hejong Kim asks, is there any possibility of coupling between the cable and the seafloor affecting the seaward, oceanward amplitudes in the cross-correlation functions?
Yeah, I think it mainly affects the frequency band 0.2 to like here 0.2 to 0.02 to 0.2 hertz, because in the shallow water, the ocean surface gravity will have a lot of effect on the cable. But when the ocean depths become deeper, it has less effect on the cable. Also, for the 0.5 to 1 hertz, it's mainly the seismic noise, not the ocean wave, because we can see it from the speed of the signal. For example, here is for the ocean wave is only 10 meters per second, but for the seismic noise, it's 100 meters per second. So we know it's a seismic wave, not the effect from the ocean wave.
Interesting. On this particular slide, actually, how much of the cable did you use to form this kind of a slide? This kind of an image.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a good question, because I used before the smallest wave number depends on the aperture of the array. So because for the ocean wave, it has a really large wave number. You can see here is around 0.01. So I use 1 kilometer for the ocean wave detecting. But for the seismic wave, I use 15 kilometers because it has relatively small wave number. So 15 kilometers for this result is from 25 to 40 kilometers on the array, I think.
Is that maybe filtering out some of the higher Schulte wave modes that you modeled, but you don't necessarily see?
Actually, I didn't filter any high mode Schulte wave, but I just didn't get it.
Right, but just by the nature of averaging over such a larger aperture.
Yeah, possibly, probably, I think. Yeah, that's why I don't get any higher mode Schulte wave, I think.
Yeah. Luis Matias asks, did you measure currents from ocean and landward ocean waves? Do you measure the currents also?
So here is this map shows the rules of the ocean wave. So you can see the ocean wave propagating in the opposite direction is around 2 to 4 seconds. But this is a 1 month average. But for the daily data, we don't have like this kind of rules map. But we can know from ocean direction. I mean wind direction. So we can see the dominant frequency is around 0.25 to 0.5 hertz. I mean for the wind like in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a thought actually while I was thinking about this is do you have any, I mean, if we had a vertical fiber suspended through the water column, do you think that we could actually see these wave-wave interactions from the vertically propagating pressure field?
I think it's pretty hard because I think the reason why 10 minutes cross correlation work is because the DAS has more sensitivity to the seismic wave that parallel to the cable. If we have the vertical cable, so it's like the particle motion will be perpendicular to the cable. So probably we cannot get it because the fiber, I think it doesn't have sensitivity for the seismic wave perpendicular. I mean, for the particle motion perpendicular to the fiber. So maybe it works for body wave, but not for the surface wave.
Yeah, that's cool. Great. So I think that if we have any more questions, I think Han, if you can answer the questions in the Q&A, that'd be great. And we're going to duck into our break now.
Okay.
So thank you very much,
Thank
Han.
you.
So we're going to
so
take it's going to be essentially an 18-minute break. We're going to reconvene at 40 minutes after the hour here. And when we come back, I mean, we're going to have, so we've had a series of presentations on really application focuses of distributed acoustic sensing, DAS. And this is the DAS RCN, which is why we focus so much on DAS here. But there's actually new technologies using fiber optic cables on the seafloors, which are just kind of expanding the way that we think about just DAS to things like measuring interferometric phase and state of polarization. So not just Rayleigh backscattering. When we come back, we're going to hear from two different speakers from industry looking at these new technologies. So join us in 17 minutes. Thanks. Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good break. Just a couple of announcements before we get going with our last two presenters for today. First, I dropped a link into the chat to join the mailing list for the Marine Geophysics Working Group. We have meetings about every other month, and if you'd like to, you can sign up there to either present or just get the link, be on our mailing list. So yeah, definitely do that if you're interested. Second announcement is that next month at our next meeting, we're going to have Rob Abbott and collaborators present on a Arctic DAS data set that was collected offshore of Alaska, off the North Slope. So that's Michael Baker from Sandia National Lab, Rob Abbott from Sandia National Lab, and also Maddie Smith and Jim Thompson from University of Washington's Applied Physics Lab. So that research collaboration looking at cool ice quakes and freeze thaw and an Arctic subsea DAS data set with a buoy. So if you're interested in that, definitely sign up with the mailing list to join that, join in on that meeting. So with that, I think I'll just switch back to Meagan. Take it away, Meagan.
Thanks, Nate. So our next speaker is Dr. Pierre Martz from the Infinera Corporation. He's going to be talking to us about seismic detection and localization using submarine cables. Dr. Martz is currently a fellow in the Advanced Optical Development Group at Infinera, developing advanced modulation formats, automation software, and fiber sensing solutions for subsea communications. He previously held positions at Hewlett-Packard Laboratories and Alvesta, and received his PhD from Princeton and a Bachelor's of Science from Cornell, and holds over 30 patents. So with that, please take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Meagan, for the kind introduction, and Nate for inviting me to present at this conference, at this webinar. Let me share the. Okay. All right, hope you see the slides. So yes, I'd like to thank, this was a lot of work from co-authors at Infinera and Google. And I'd like to particularly thank Valet Kamalov for really initiating and driving the use of the submarine cable infrastructure for early detection of tsunamis. So the talk is titled Seismic Detection and Localization using Submarine Cables. So I'll start with the motivation of this work, go to the experimental setup, and then show some results from a very recent field trial, and then some conclusions. So for the motivation, Professor Richard Allen from Berkeley published a recent paper, February 18th, in the journal Science, entitled Global Growth of Earthquake Early Warning. And this shows like the work over the last 10 years or so of using the private infrastructure for public early warning detection. And it shows some of the work taken and how the Android operating system works with the governments to expand its early warning in this region over here and down in the Ring of Fire. And so the motivation of this talk is to try to extend this early warning to not just be earthquakes, but to also include tsunamis. So this is a map from the IRIS Wilbur 3 webpage of seismometers, and there are many more seismometers than are listed here that are land-based. But the point of this this presentation is really to look at the ocean-based ones, and they're only in the, they look like they're in the ocean, but they're actually on islands. Like this one is on the South Georgia Island on the bottom here. And so the motivation is, well, every 200 kilometers between an earthquake and a sensor results in 1 minute delay in any possible early warning. So if we overlay the subsea map on here, you can see the motivation behind trying to use the cable infrastructure, the existing communication cable infrastructure, to increase the presence of detection in the oceans. The difficulty is that these cables are lines, so they're not point detectors, and it's desirable, but these cables do have repeaters every 50 to 100 kilometers. So the motivation here is to explore, well, can we use the repeaters or the cable between repeaters as sensors, and by doing so, we can reduce the distance from the earthquake to that nearest sensor. And then overlaying from Cornell, there's a nice map of the earthquakes and their proximity to land and population centers. And you can see that, especially in the Ring of Fire, there's some nice overlap outside of Japan, in the Mediterranean, and even in the Atlantic of some of the fiber cables and the where earthquakes are localized. So prior work, this was a nice paper in 2021 by Google and also Professor Microseisms at University of L'Aquila, and also CalTech, and what this work is pretty much one of the first that uses a submarine cable to detect seismic activity. And in this case, these bright red streaks are actually ocean swells, and they change in frequency as the storms pass and the frequencies of the waves change. This is a 12-day collection of data and shows some nice storms propagating. Now, this data comes from SOP streams from coherent transponders on both sides. So you get one measurement from either side of the cable, and the measurement is the integrated state of polarization. So SOP is a state of polarization, and it's that integration across the entire cable. And so it's very difficult to localize where these events happen on that cable. Now, seismometers really would like to see 2D arrays of data, and this shows up from the IRIS Wilbur 3 or IRIS website on the teachable moments that during the Fukushima earthquake, the US array happened to be operational in parts of the United States. And it shows the, the wealth of data you can get from a 2D array and how it could help generate, accurate models of the Earth and validate those models. So for point sensors, there are, you can get ocean bottom seismometers, and they do rest on the seafloor. The issue is there's no communication, so you have to store data for a period of time and bring them to the surface to retrieve that data. And they're battery powered, so the longer they're in the ocean, the less sampling interval you can have. But you can place them anywhere you want. So that's in the Pacific Northwest. There's a nice 2D array of these out in the ocean. Now in this talk, the motivation is to try, well, can we use repeaters themselves in this cable between those repeaters as the sensor? And these also rest on the seafloor, but since they're connected to the cable, the SOP data is actually created on the SLTE equipment, and SLTE means a submarine line terminating equipment, and that equipment is on land. So the nice capability is you can stream that data in real time to create actionable results. It's also shore powered, of course, and but the issue is, on a cable like on the Curry cable on the right, you can see the positions of the repeaters, and this just creates a 1D array of data. Now, but you can imagine all of the cables in the world, if you have, then with all of them together, you could create a 2D array, or at least out of even some of them. So the experimental setup. So let's focus on the repeater section. What's inside a repeater that we can use to get a state of polarization per repeater? And it turns out every single repeater they were designed with these HLLBs that are high loss loopback devices. And what happens is these are designed to localize point losses on the fiber. And what they do is they'll take the Rayleigh backscattering and then couple it back to the other direction. Okay. So then you can use a COTDR instrument to find point losses. Many of these cables also include these fiber Bragg gratings, and these are spectrally narrow filters on either side of the usable bandwidth of the cable, and they're typically used to measure the tilt changes, so that to measure repeater amplifier failures and to know when to replace an amplifier. And so these will reflect much higher light than the Rayleigh backscattering. It's a full reflection. But there is significant loss in this. They put a real large attenuation to prevent too much light coming back and interfering with the communication channel. So what we're using in this experiment is we have a communication line card. It contains two 800G channels. We're using one of these 800G channels. This is the data carrying portion. And we break up the carrier into 8 subcarriers. That's why you see 8 little sections, but this is one laser. And then this is in the usable part of the spectrum. And then it has the capability of generating a tone. And what we do is we put that tone to overlap the FBG, the fiber Bragg grating in the repeater. And then what we can do is monitor the reflections through a narrowband filter to filter out that tone and look at the polarization. What we also do on the shore is put a little coupler here. So on the animation, you'll see we pulse this tone, and as it comes back through the coupler, we analyze it, and it creates a pulse in the polarimeter. And then it goes through another repeater, you see the pulse in the polarimeter. Other repeaters, you see a pulse in the polarimeter. And what this does is it turns time into distance. So what does this look like on the Curry cable? So the Curry cable is 10,000 kilometers. And this is a measurement of a single pulse. And instead of just looking at the intensity here, it's looking at the S1, these SO state of polarization parameters. These are Stokes parameters. So you get 3 curves and you get a pulse reflected from each of the 110 repeaters on the Curry cable. These are 300 microsecond pulses at, and we're limited by the reflection time, which is around 105 milliseconds between when we can send pulses. And what we do is we take a look at one of these repeaters and measure over time. And here we'll see some surface waves. So in this case, the data is stored in the database and post-processed, and we'll be streaming this very soon. So some of that post-processing, what does that include? It includes creating spectrograms. Now, remember, each pulse will be the state of polarization from the shore to the repeater and back to shore again. So integrated across that entire section. And you can see even that integral, you get some nice spectrogram, sharp little things at various frequencies. We're not sure. These look like, we think they're ocean swells. We're not sure what these are. But what we can do is try to subtract we'd like to subtract one repeater from another repeater to look at what the state of polarization is effect on the, using that span between the two cables. And turns out that for small polarization variations, a simple subtraction of scaled Stokes parameters does quite well at removing some of this noise and accentuating some other features. For larger, polarization variations from, it'd be very useful to add. This was only done from one side. Having it from the other side would mean you'd have a clean signal, from where the seismic event occurred. So on February 22nd this year, there was an earthquake in Argentina, a magnitude 6 earthquake, and we actually detected this using this technique, and this is a seismogram of repeater 104 using that subtraction technique. This is some nice data from Zhang Wen and CalTech, who calculated, this is actually repeater 102, which is right here. Here's the earthquake. And so since there's a distance between the earthquake, and this was a very deep earthquake as well, you can calculate from where we know the earthquake happened from the Wilbur website. You calculate the distance to get when the P wave is supposed to get there. And then he shows with the S wave on the same data that we see a nice earthquake signature of that S wave. Now, if we look over the repeaters, the signals over the repeaters using that subtraction technique, you can sort of imagine overlaying sort of the earthquake comes here from below and starts to propagate down the cable slightly. Here's an overlay in time matching the time of a land-based seismometer here as well. And then some nice modeling. This is a simulation using a 1D and laterally homogeneous Earth, and you can, from the deep earthquake, you can see it sort of coming in, and then it propagates down the cable. So it comes up from above and then down from below, and then goes across. And you can see some really nice overlap with the data. Now up here is most likely because that subtraction mechanism is not perfect, but there's also more realistic simulations. So this is done by Jorge Castellanos at Google. And then finally, we have a nice overlay of all 110 repeaters over a 3-hour period or 2-hour period, and shows clearly the that we can localize, detect and localize an earthquake using this technique of SOP sensitive OTDR. So in conclusion, we've demonstrated a novel OTDR technique, SOP sensitive OTDR technique to localize these seismic events. We use this polarization subtraction method to produce an SOP per span. And this can, the main motivation is that it can provide actionable real-time data for tsunami early warning. And then presented the results on the Curry cable and the detection and localization of the magnitude 6 earthquake in Argentina. Right, thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. That was a great talk. There's some questions coming in the chat or the Q&A. So the first one is, how do you get one signal to analyze from S1, S2, S3 vector?
Oh, great question. I glossed over that point. These are actually, this is just looking at S1. But there is a nice technique to get from S1, S2, S3 to a single, to two polarizations. And that was presented in the in that paper from Google and in 2021. And we use the same technique. And what that does is you, over a 200-second period, you try to rotate the Poincaré sphere so that the average polarization is on the North Pole, and then you just have a S1 and S2. This just shows S1. After that, there's a very similar plot for S2. But what we should do is sum up the energy in both of those to get a plot.
Then that was from Luis Matthijs. The next one's from Jesse Hutchinson. Are you limited up to 1 Hertz data? I imagine if you had a higher sampling rate up to 20 Hertz, you might be able to visualize the P phase for earthquakes.
Yeah, that's a great question. We'd like to increase for this technique. We are limited to that reflection rate. When in the future we may be able to speed things up. But you need a different polarization analyzer for each, to send multiple pulses. But with this technique using a third-party polarization analyzer, yeah, we're limited to that low. But it's limited by the cable length. So, like, say you do a shorter cable, like from Guam to Japan or something like that, or the Philippines to Japan, you might be able to. Then you could speed it up significantly.
Okay, great. So Roger Crickmore asks, can you explain why there is a large variation between the size of signals seen on nearby channels?
Yes, that would be, this is just, you mean the size of these pulses. So this first pulse is the onshore loop back to get a trigger signal for another measurement. But these are basically, if you look at each repeater, they're actually this. I didn't show it, but whoop, let me go back to. I didn't show it here, but there's a something you put in, an attenuator here that you put in, and the variation in these attenuators is what causes the variation in the signal height. And what's interesting is you can see, right here is when they're close together, there's a branching unit. So you can almost imagine one ship coming in and the calibration is slightly different than the other ship coming in, and they connect up the branching unit.
And what is the expected minimum detectable earthquake magnitude?
Yeah, so this is not nearly as sensitive as the fiber acoustic sensing. What's nice is it does go across the entire cable, so you get the, we haven't seen anything less than that magnitude 6 so far. So the 6 is, but the real motivation on this is for early warning of tsunamis, and so those need a magnitude 7 or above, so that this would be a good solution for that early warning system.
Okay. Yeah, that was a question I had too. Is you motivated the talk with early warning for tsunamis, I guess we know that all earthquakes don't necessarily produce a tsunami. Could you actually see a tsunami propagating with this technique?
That's an excellent question. If the cable goes across the Pacific and there is a tsunami, what's neat is this does detect ocean swells as well. So you might be able to see the earthquake propagating at a different velocity than the pressure wave from the tsunami propagating. But of it, we haven't. We need data to verify.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's not the best data you want.
Well, thank you so much, Pierre. That was great. There's a few more questions or comments in the Q&A if you want to go through and type some answers to them. And with that, I'll hand it back to Nate.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Megan. So our last speaker today is joining us from Nokia Bell Labs. So Mikhail Measure from Nokia Bell Labs. His title of his talk is Environmental Sensing Using Coherent Optical Transceivers. Dr. Mikhail Measure received his PhD from Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden in 2019. In his dissertation, he studied optical frequency combs in optical communications, focusing on signal processing schemes enabled by the comb coherence. In January 2020, he joined Bell Labs New Jersey as a member of technical staff in the Advanced Photonics Research Department. At Bell Labs, he developed subsystems and techniques for space division multiplexing in coupled core and multi-mode optical fibers, investigates multi-mode arbitrary waveform synthesis, and develops real-time signal processing techniques for optical transmission and fiber sensing systems. He's a member of IEEE and Optica, formerly Optical Society of America. So thank you very much, Mikhail. Take it away.
Let's see, share. Great. So thanks, Nate, and thanks you for the kind introduction and for inviting me to this webinar. So this work is on a slightly different angle for how to do environmental sensing. Let's say moving away from DAS and more looking at it in terms of how can we really use general purpose telecom infrastructure to do this. So as Nate said, I'm with Bell Labs in New Jersey, but this work involved a lot of people, both from our side, from Google, from Chalmers University in Sweden, as well as the Nokia business unit. And I think as we move on, it will be pretty clear why it takes a lot of people to do this. But so what we are trying to do is really to say, we know that DAS is phenomenal. We are, of course, big fans of using DAS. There has been multiple key studies in the environmental sensing area showing really, really impressive results. Two of them are highlighted here, both on ocean side and also lately people have been climbing and done DAS on glaciers. But DAS is actually only one of multiple sensing methods that people are using. It's a great one, but there's also, of course, the Raman and Baleen scattering systems, as well as maybe laser interferometry and polarization sensing, where laser interferometry using optical phase is something that is really, really hard to do. But if you realize it has a huge potential to enable incredible sensitivity. So to look at this from a slightly more in-depth, what is actually DAS doing? So we're using Rayleigh backscattering, and we're sending normally short pulses, so temporal pulses, and look at the light that is reflected back as we propagate along the fiber. This gives a very, very high resolution and enables localization. That is great. And when we move on and do coherent DAS or coherent OTDR, we also can start doing coherent averaging and really enable new kind of signal processing techniques. But there are inherent challenges and drawbacks with this. Some of them are associated with the technique itself, like backscattering optical fibers is weak. There are fibers specifically designed for this purpose, designed to do sensing, where you get a much, much clearer backscattering signal. So if you are to deploy a fiber solely for the purpose of sensing, those are great. But in terms of using regular telecom infrastructure, we're normally limited to, let's say, the standard single mode fiber systems that we like for doing communication. The other thing is that access to, let's say, the fiber infrastructure itself can be pretty challenging. So in this case, both we and also Pierre work with Google. Google are very interested in this, and it's a great opportunity. However, I think most of the people in this community also know that it's usually not so easy to get access to actual telecom infrastructure And we heard the previous speaker mention that they had to wait for a downtime or an upgrade and so on, meaning that just accessing the fiber might be challenging, which of course boils back to this general problem that the worldwide fiber grid is huge. It goes everywhere from your home all the way to connecting continents. But it is a telecommunication network. It is a huge telecommunication network. It's expanding every day because we need more and more connectivity, but it is a network that was designed and built and paid for with the purpose of doing communication. So of course, in terms of, let's say, scientific studies, it would be great to just say, let's put out cables everywhere and dedicate a couple of them and make sure that they stay dark forever and that we can use them for basically, let's say, scientific purposes. But the question always then boils down to who's going to pay for this, and as well, is it compatible with communication? And for us in the telecom field, this is something that we actually face quite often. That if you ask to do something on a live network, the first question is, can we make sure that this under no circumstances might interrupt regular traffic flows? So what would it take to create like a distributed DAS sensor all over the fiber grid? Well, as I said, they require normally dedicated wavelengths of dark fiber. It was hinted about before, and there's been a lot of development to do narrowband DAS so that you can co-propagate it with telecom signals. And I think that's a big step to realizing at least short reach, but let's say more general access to fiber infrastructure. But there might be a bigger problem than that, and that is that it doesn't pass unidirectional amplifiers or ROADMs, which are basically optical switches. So the way this network is created and configured is that you use optical switches to send light back and forth along the system, and those unfortunately does not let the DAS signal pass through. So we really need to access the fiber right at the point, which makes accessing the infrastructure and especially reconfiguring the infrastructure quite cumbersome. The other side of this is really that DAS is expensive. I think all the scientists on a workshop like this are very well aware, but putting out DAS equipment is expensive. And if we're looking at like the fiber grid, how fast the fiber grid is expanding, like putting DAS everywhere is associated with huge cost. And then once again, even if you had the money to do so, the question is if you would get access to the infrastructure. So would there be an alternative? And the network is actually used to transmit information. And if we look a little bit at how this is done, we use what is called coherent optical transceivers. I'm a little bit lucky now because Pierre gave a little bit of introduction to it. But the way we can see this is basically that these are incredibly flexible, high-speed communication modules, transmitting like information flows up to 800 gigabit per second at the moment per wavelength. And without going into detail about how they work, we can say that these are the kind of workhorses of the backbone network. So if the fiber is the medium we transmit information over, these transceivers are the one that actually generates and detect the signals. There are some important remarks here. The first one is that even if you have like a fiber and a state-of-the-art 800G module, most systems require somewhere between, let's say, 50 to 100 transceivers to actually fill the total available bandwidth. And the general implication of this is that there's a huge amount of transceivers out there, and it's rapidly growing. Each transceiver is also highly reconfigurable, so you can actually have buy a single transceiver that could do distances from maybe 10 to larger than 10,000 kilometers. So in contrast to the DAS that has a fairly limited operation regime, these state-of-the-art coherent transceivers cover huge distances. And in terms of, let's say, looking at them from a sensing perspective, there is another important aspect of this. And that is that they use multiple independent dimensions to transmit information. But more importantly, that they actually use all the available dimensions in an optical fiber. So if we look at what kind of dimension we can use to describe the light wave inside a single mode fiber, like frequency, amplitude, phase, and polarization, we already use all of those to transmit information. We realize this using large amounts of digital signal processing, but the important part is that any effect that perturb the fiber will fall within a space that is covered by these degrees of freedom. So if we look at it, we have the digital signal processing. It does both static and dynamic impairments. It does the general kind of filtering things to, let's say, maximize the signal received quality. But any effect that perturbs the fiber, that causes this DSP to react in a way that it would act as a sensor, will fall within what is covered by the DSP engine itself. So what we're trying to do in this work is to say, rather than just putting out dedicated sensors, that is great, and it's, if you can do it everywhere, that would be absolutely awesome. But is there a way to transform every coherent transceiver into an environmental sensor itself? because at that point, it would be associated with no loss in spectral efficiency or requiring no dark fibers. And it's more like a tag-on feature that would be done, even though the original purpose was just to transmit information. So it's more like a tag-along scheme. So what we're really trying to achieve is we're trying to learn to see through the eyes of a coherent communication DSP engine. So if we look at the DAS itself, we know that if you bend the fiber, if you twist it, we do strain monitoring, we are having a great sensitivity to see these effects. Such effect as well would, for example, affect optical phase, and they are tracked by the coherent DSP engine itself. But there are some inherent challenges with doing this. So if we look at a DAS system, we're looking at, let's say, update rates of about 100 megahertz, or sorry, like a few hertz. The DSP updates about 100 megahertz order of magnitude. And it also uses much lower resolution and noisier signals. But it also comes with some gains. And one of the gains being that this system is inherently real time. So we talked a lot about what is the update rate and how often can you measure and so on. This is the measure continuously all the time. So there are no dead zones whatsoever. But the information is then hidden within this block designed to do transmission. And that's what we're trying to get out of it. So the question then comes, what are we actually looking for? And this is a very general slide. The focus of this workshop is slightly more narrowed down. What I wanted to say is yes, that if you start doing sensing from a very broad perspective, once again, because we like a single transceiver module to cover a very broad sensing area, we're looking at a time scale of events that probably span somewhere around 9 orders of magnitude. If we combine this knowledge with how the DSP engine operates, we end up with a little bit of a challenge. So if we say we're interested in detecting a wave period that might be around a second or so, we end up with an event that is scattered over 1 billion sampling points. So in terms of doing signal processing, this is a big challenge because the amount of data that needs to be simultaneously processed is a lot. But we still believe that if you could realize this, you could actually maybe transform the telecommunication grid into a more general scientific instrument. And that's why we developed this prototype. So we took a coherent transceiver implementation. So it's something that was designed solely for the purpose of transmitting data. And we implemented a prototype using feed programmable gate arrays to see if we could also add phase and polarization sensing without actually affecting the data flow. So every clock cycle that this system transmits data, basically as being bits, ones and zeros, it also gathers a lot of sensing information. We brought the system to Virginia Beach, and we put it over the DUNON cable system, which is one of Google's transatlantic cables connecting the US and France. An interesting aspect of this, since we have access to very high sampling rate, is that we can basically do, for example, phase sensing, covering, in this case, from about 10 millihertz all the way up to kilohertz regime. So we really cover a very large frequency range. And actually sampling fast is very easy with this system. Sampling slow is harder. The other point of this is that the telecommunication network, as Pierre also mentioned, is really designed to transmit information. So we can just use the infrastructure that's already there to tag along the information and send it to the cloud. So what do we read out? We do the basic SOP. So this is just a way of saying, how does the state of polarization change as we propagate along the fiber? In addition to this, we use the laser phase. So to create a phase interferometer out of the system. So we already use the phase to transmit information. So we modulate the phase to carry bits and zeros. What we do in this case is that the same tracking algorithm that is used to basically remove any phase fluctuations from the fiber is turned into a sensor, extracting this information to a readout block that looks at it and say what is actually happening to the fiber. And by combining all these blocks, we think that you can actually try to reconstruct what is going on along the fiber. So the challenge with the phase was just to mention, I think that that's why you want multiple sensors. We're talking about very, very long propagation distances, more than 10,000 kilometers. So you need an extremely coherent system if you want to do phase. Nevertheless, the final thing is just we couple the system in and out. The system is completely compatible with general telecommunication infrastructure. It doesn't require any site access. It would just basically be any other transceiver with some extra features. So if you're interested in a spectrum, here's where it's sitting. It has a loading laser to take care of some power, but otherwise it acts as any other channel going over the network. So if you look in detail at this, you can actually start observing quite some events. So what we were very surprised about in the beginning was how well it actually works to sense very slow events, even though we're sampling so fast. So what you see down here to the right is basically a spectrogram covering the primary and secondary microseismic bands measured over a month. So this was the first month we did the trial, started end of July last year. And we observed multiple swell events, etc., showing that we actually have quite high sensitivity in these bands. And for us, this was something we didn't expect because once again, this system was not designed to do sensing. It was designed to transmit information. The more you look into this, covering more months and so on, we observe more and more events. We see very strong correlation to waves and basically also ocean currents. You can observe cable movements. So it seems that by actually combining the correct pre and post processing with regular telecommunication transceivers, you can get pretty far. You can do some more things. So beyond this single Stokes vector, there is actually 2 polarizations supported by the system. And if you're looking at the phase between these two, you have a very, very sensitive interferometer. So we also extracted this information. And by doing so, we have extra data to try to understand some oscillations. So we do observe cable oscillations at around 1-2 hertz, basically seen to be overtone. At this moment, we're actually not sure why this happens or exactly where they originate from. But the more we look into it, we hope to be able to analyze that. What is important to us is that we have a very high sensitivity, basically from, let's say, 100 or 10 millihertz even down there for polarization, all the way up by combining polarization of phase to hundreds of hertz. And the background noise is very low. So the system is continuously sitting there gathering data. We do have a lot of data. We're always looking for input on how to process it and what to look for. And of course, looking for interested event. But why I was so glad to be able to give this talk and what we think in general is that although DAS and all these systems are great dedicated sensor, there might be more possibilities to use the sheer number of transceivers out there as a complement. Because we're literally talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of transceivers sitting there. And I think deploying the same number of DAS systems would be very hard, even if you could overcome the other challenges. So to summarize, I just presented a brief introduction to the work we're doing on sensing using coherent transceivers. And this is really our way to try to complement dedicated fiber sensors with the capabilities of modern digital coherent transceivers. And one of the key aspects, especially coming from us as a telecom vendor, is that they don't require any dark fibers to dedicate the wavelength. They don't require any modification of the infrastructure accessing sites. And we show that you can actually do both polarization and phase sensing in real time using the coherent DSP engine itself. The results are mainly from a field trial that is ongoing of the Google Do Not Cable system, where we observe multiple environmental events spanning from millihertz and up. And if you look in the phase, this might be a little bit hard to see on the screen here, phase spectrum going all the way up to 1 kilohertz, there's event all the way up. And you can even identify the traffic flows and figure out when rush hour occurs in Virginia Beach in the US and on the French side, which also we use as a great way to subtract measurement noise and understand the time dependence of the sensor itself. So it's ongoing work. We hope to improve it for the future, and we're always very open and interested in if people from the scientific fields have a good suggestions for what to study or how to study it to make sure that this kind of technology could be as useful as possible from a broader perspective. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mikkel. That's a great overview, and I think a really appropriate kind of level for this kind of audience, which is not familiar with photonics very much. Kind of impressed by the dispersion that's going on in this field. I think you can see that we're a DAS research coordination network, NSF funded, in order to study DAS because that was making waves. But here, all these other topics are coming in for measurement of geophysics. So yeah, thanks very much for your talk. There is a question that came in about just the expense of doing this. So you mentioned that DAS is very expensive. Can you put some raw numbers on that in terms of what these coherent transponders cost-wise would take to operate?
That's a great question, and someone who works for Bell Labs probably should be able to give an exact answer. I don't know the exact numbers. It also depends a lot on what kind of feature set and so on it has. A transceiver is somewhere around $10,000 normally, give or take, and up around there. I think the motivation from our side for doing this a lot is that the fundamental idea is that someone else would take that cost. So these transceivers are from us or from other manufacturers are being sold every day to be used as telecommunication infrastructure. And this kind of sensing does not in any way impair that functionality. So they're sitting there, they're doing their job as a backbone of the internet, carrying our Netflix or whatever traffic around the globe. And this is merely an add-on feature. And this was something that was very important to us, and has been a major constraint when we do this work, that we don't want to redesign the system. So it's very clear that a DAS is much more sensitive or has features optimized for sensing that we don't have. And our interest is not so much to, let's say, create the DAS again or rediscover this by really modifying the basics, but rather say, if we have a system that is optimized for telecommunication, is there still a possibility to use this for other purposes, such as like geophysical studies or monitoring climate change, ocean currents, and so on? So some of the submarine cables have these reflectors, for example, all don't have it, and so on. And I think the core thing here is that some companies are very much into this. Others are very, very reluctant to actually putting sensing infrastructures on their cables or on their grid. I think this is something that is very well known in this community too. You probably at least sometimes struggle to get access. And in this case, there is no access involved with it. It's just you have a transceiver, it transmits information, that's it. And the only thing is that you have additional outputs. So similar to monitoring, if there are errors from the data transmission, you would monitor spectrogram information and so on. And that was a very important assumption for us when we started this work.
Yeah, I guess a follow-up on that, like from the transmission standpoint, you mentioned that this information is obviously being used. Is it stored?
So that's the thing. Normally not. So the information we extract is kind of hidden within feedback loops inside the signal processing engine. So you can say that, for example, if you take state of polarization, the receiver tries to undo any fiber changes to make sure that it's aligned, at least in a digital way, with the transmitter. And most of the time, traditionally at least, or at high sampling rate, you don't really store that. You just let the receiver do its job and continuously update it. And that's the twist we are doing now, that we're basically trying to say, don't just throw that information away, actually keep it, because it might be useful in various ways. It is a big challenge though, and it's something that we're trying to look more into what information to store and how. Because as I said, we're talking about a system that updates maybe 100 million times a second, or usually more than that. So
right.
Storing all this information just overwhelms everything. And hopefully by gaining more understanding for in which areas this might complement techniques such as DAS, we can also more and more narrow down what information actually makes sense to store and what information you can kind of remove in the, I don't know, real-time pre-processing stage.
Yeah, very cool. I guess Richard Gibson asks, you mentioned it's harder to measure slower with this type of system. Can you comment on why it's more difficult to do that?
And that's a great question. So what I meant to say with that is there are kind of two main problems. The first one is that since the system is designed to measure very, very fast, and let's say sampling rates of 100 billion samples or more per second, when you design such signal converters, you inherently make signal to noise ratio trade-offs. So if you were to design, let's say, a receiver for a DAS system, and you say we cap it at 5 kilohertz, you can have much more sensitive electronics than you can at this signal rate. So that's like a fundamental thing more. The other thing of it is just that if you look at relative change in processing, or for example, the amount of samples you need to process to see the change, we are working with so many more orders of magnitude samples that it's harder to process it. And it's harder to keep track of it and do these intermediate storing stages. Just buffering, let's say, a few seconds of data, if you want to buffer all of it, it's already up to like 10 gigabyte. So I think those two are the kind of, let's say, things that balance it. So when you do these very slow measurements, there's just a lot of data to work with and filter out and so on to make sure that you cancel out effects. Some previous speaker also mentioned calibration, and I think that's another side of this area that, since we normally try to say this nice, if you look at an effect that happens around, let's say, hertz level, that's completely uninteresting for a telecom system in terms of like any performance for communication. So you wouldn't really necessarily design it to calibrate these effects out. You just let the DSP handle it. And that's another thing that we're looking at different regimes. So there's actually drifts inherently from products over the similar timescales. So that's why like accurate calibration and also post-processing is so important to separate, let's say, fiber effects from inherent drifts inside the transceiver.
Good. Another question. Motion Kavian asks, do you see any correlation between the fiber cable vibration noise and the communication error rate measured?
So that's a great question. We do to some extent. Usually the cable is very quiet. So if you ask a communication person, like transmitting over submarine cables is challenging because the distance is very long. But in terms of every other effect, it's a great medium because it's so quiet and it's so stable. So most of the effects we see, which are very strong and that would induce errors, would actually be more associated with someone doing something dumbish on a landing site, like touching a patch panel or so. If you look at the readouts in terms of, for example, signal noise rate, you do see effects. We can see very, very small effects over time that the transceiver is reacting to things. However, these are not giving any performance penalties so far. So the effects we're looking at here are all within the DSP tracking engine, and they don't, like, neither phase nor polarization here would actually affect the signal to noise ratio, which is what in this case dictates the error rate. So I'm not sure if that was answering the question, but most of the effects we're looking at for environmental sensing does not affect transmission performance.
Yeah, that's clear. I guess the last question kind of touched on from a couple of different folks is the maybe because of the previous talk, the question of kind of spatial resolution or multiplexing opportunities. Like, is it possible to determine where a disturbance occurred? And maybe thinking about it in the future too, like, is there a thought that this could be used in a repeated fashion?
Yes.
Similar to what Pierre was discussing? No,
definitely. I think absolutely. So first of all, using the submarine repeaters, as Pierre said, and I mean, they also use let's say a slightly modified version of their normal transceiver to generate the tone, which is another step in this area. It's really, really impressive. So I think using the reflectors is certainly one area. The other thing is to combine information from multiple transceivers, which is something we also work on. And that's a little bit what I tried to hint on when I said that there are multiple transceivers per fiber, there are multiple fibers per cable, and there are a ton of cables out there. And I think that's another area where using transceivers might really be beneficial. So a DAS gives you extremely good sensitivity where you're measuring it, but it's hard to put them everywhere and scale it up. I think transceivers is kind of coming from the other direction more, where you might say that the actual resolution or sensitivity per transceiver is less, but there are a lot of them, and there are a lot of them of different cables. And both we and others from other industry labs and companies are actively working on ways to synchronize transceivers and figure out different ways to use them for localization. So I think the repeaters are great if they're there, but there are also other schemes just involving, let's say, multiple sampling schemes that gives you localization information. The results here was really, there was a first test to see what do we get out of the system at all. And now when we have a better understanding for what we can see, this is something we're actively looking at.
Yeah, that's very exciting. I think this is just the beginning of a whole field, hopefully. Great. Well, thank you, Mikhail. I'm gonna kind of, I think we're gonna move into the panel discussion now. So yeah, if we can just kind of have everyone join us, I guess, for about, yeah, all of our speakers. I think Han had to take off. He said he had to go give a talk to Zhongwen Shan's group at CalTech, actually, I think. So he's off. But I guess, so we're gonna have 20 minutes or so here to discuss kind of as a panel, and we can kind of take questions to the audience here. If there's any questions that kind of come up, please just continue to put them into the Q&A. One question that kind of I thought we'd just lead off with is kind of thinking about the operational side of this. Like, how is everything that you're going to do, you know, back to Leah's discussion of kind of whales, you know, whale sensing, to William and Ethan's talk about, you know, using this on the OOI cable for a short period of time. You know, how are we going to operationalize this to a kind of a continuous mode where we can use this as a scientific kind of facility? Is that in the future? Like, how do we get there from here, I guess? Anyone can jump in on that.
I think that's a tough one. I can give a little bit of insight from our side. To me, one of the big questions is data storage. And so if we want to have DAS installations or as some kind of permanent installations for continuous monitoring, I believe that the way to go is to kind of sort out the data and keep only what we need. But I'm not sure that everyone would agree with that, because there are always many, well, things that we learn afterward and like, oh, well, we could have kept that data and we don't have it anymore. So I would be happy to hear other thoughts.
Is it really that challenging for sort of earthquake sampling rates? As particularly if you make the channel spacing similar to a sort of 20-meter gauge length? You know, that's you know, a few tens of terabytes per year for system, which doesn't seem that much compared with some storage needs. And certainly if we start trying to sense, you know, high frequency marine mammals and it works for that, then yeah, that's going to be a huge challenge. But
I mean, streaming to the cloud, you know, and Google does that already with all the cables with the from coherent receivers. But I keep mentioning the Wilbur 3 website. That model is very nice because it has events that you can click on and get data from all the sensors. So having some, you know, having the raw data there is tough to analyze, but having some sort of keeping the raw data there, but having some metadata on top of it saying, hey, this was an earthquake, here's the sensors around it, here's some processing, here's when you expect the P wave, the S wave. I think that's incredibly useful. So somehow extending to that model, I think would be great.
Is there any plan for the SOP data or the phase data that would be kind of like partnered into scientific institutions to be made available, even if it was in a latent kind of sense? Here's 3 months ago's data, you know, sampled at 1 second, something really low frequency.
I don't know of any, but I can see that would be a path forward to that would be useful for the scientific and general community. I mean, the main intent here would be early warning, but if that data, you know, that data is stored, so making it available. But then, you know, how do you pass through the Navy with that as well?
Yeah,
do they have to look at it? Do they have? So that's an interesting twist, which we haven't thought of.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the lower frequency, William can comment on this, I mean, the lower frequencies are not as interesting to the Navy from an operational standpoint.
yeah, from the cabled observatories, they pass through 8 hertz data, so basically 4 hertz signals and lower of not of concern to the Navy. So we get those permanently, continuously from seismometers.
I have a question for the panel. What do you think the influence of burial of the cable is, or burial or unburial on your signals?
I can maybe go first. I think there's quite significant influence of how the cable is buried, and also depending on the actual seabed where it's buried. There are also a lot of other parameters associated with cables that I think are largely unknown. Like there are multiple cable vendors out there deploying cables. So I think that there's a lot of work. I mean, I really hope this technology flies, but to really understand these cables from a new perspective, because I think for a lot of the companies developing and deploying submarine systems, this is kind of a new niche. And until now, it has basically been focusing on making sure that the cable is cost effective, but also as solid as possible to make sure it doesn't break, because that's normally the telecom goal, make sure that it's reliable. And I think inherently with that, there's going to be trade-offs done that affect sensing. And hopefully the more data is available and also more studies being conducted over various cables and various places, will kind of aid with that understanding. But I do think that there's a lot of dependence on that. And it's something we can see a little bit with the loopback configurations too, that we don't necessarily observe the same sensitivity, for example, on both shore ends. So in like we have different sensitivity, different effects on the, let's say, US side versus European side and so on.
Another question. I think one of you mentioned oscillation of the cable potentially influencing your data. Maybe that was you, Mikkel. I hadn't really thought about that before. I was wondering just how that would influence like sensing on fiber optic cables in general.
I think it's a great question, and kind of one reason why we pose it as well is to say that the more we dive into this space, the more things we figure out that we actually don't really know the answer to. For some reasons, I can see why you certainly want like a cable that is buried and as well attached to the seabed as possible. Maybe if you have a more cable laying on the seabed, or actually that is also suspended, or crossing certain things underwater, there might be other opportunities for using that for other, let's say, geophysical studies. How those things work are outside my area of expertise. I think that's more for US community. But I do think that there are inherent pros and cons with different kinds of cable deployment and different kind of styles and so on of cables that affect sensing. And hopefully, since there's so much work coming out in this field at the moment, and also so much impressive study from the physical communities, I think that's also something that is going to help and aid with it, because I think a lot of it now is also just that people don't really consider it. Like, it's not part of the final test done on a cable to make sure how good it works as a sensor. You measure the signal performance and make sure that it carries the information you want, and then you sign it off. And the more information that is gained and the more understanding that comes up in this field, the better it is. And I think, for example, when you go to a telecommunication conference and you hear how many people discuss that you could use the cable to sense whales, I think that's a big step towards kind of broadening the understanding and the use case of cables from that so far had a very, at least in my opinion, single purpose usage. So I think that's a very big step for like merging and combining knowledge and share between multiple scientific communities.
Well, this is something I would like to resonate with because, well, as we can see, this is this is extremely multidisciplinary, and we're already talking about data storage and everything. And so, well, I guess in a sense, it's good to make as much use as we can of those data and try to, well, use it as best as we can. And so, yeah, it does involve a lot of people. And I think so far from the response of the audience, but also from a few person I've been talking to before, I think this is already in mind, and I feel like this is great. And I know also from not only baleen whale perspective, but just underwater acoustics, it's also an incredible opportunity for, well, distance sampling and ground truthing our acoustic propagation models as well. So in terms of acoustics and physics of the oceans, also extremely interesting. So kind of the broader the merrier in a way. And I'm really grateful to be part of these discussions. So.
Yeah, and maybe as another thing along those lines, when in our collaboration, I mean, Jorge from Google and also co-authors and collaborative input from CalTech and so on has been absolutely invaluable. And I think that's kind of a challenge, because we do generate a lot of data, and most of the data, you need some kind of starting point or information from other sensors just to understand. Because for us, these are very new sensors. So, and we really rely on understanding from like your field to figure out what kind of sensitivity we might have to different things. And I think that's also a very important kind of collaboration, future step ahead, to say there's been a ton of very impressive work done over decades of understanding the world of geophysics. And by relying on that, I think we can also, in a much faster and more effective way, narrow down what kind of things we can really use this cable for, and probably figure out other areas where we have very low sensitivity as well.
I have a sort of general comment. There's a sort of parallel effort to try and get the concept of smart cables going ahead, where you actually put sensors within the repeaters. And I could understand that, that's a big sell for transoceanic commercial cables, but it's probably coming on regional cables that maybe are deployed by single countries or, with some research focuses. And it just seems that it would be extremely useful to be testing these sensing techniques, especially these transoceanic sensing techniques, on cables that have, an accelerometer or a seismometer in each repeater. And I'd just be interested in the comments from people in the sort of commercial realm.
Pierre, I don't know, I think both of us would say that we agree. Then cable deployment is also a very, very long process. And at least to my knowledge, the smart cables are pretty new. And of course, I think anything we're working on here, if you compare that to putting, let's say, a dedicated accelerometer on the ocean floor that is only built to do that, the winner is pretty clear. So I think from our perspective, it's kind of a twofold approach. So first, it's to say the techniques we're working now would actually be backwards compatible. So the smart cables, even if you would purchase one now, would be years away from deployment, and it's something that probably comes with the future. I'm not personally aware what latency and so on is as well in the trade-offs and how much information that is actually generated by these sensors. I do think they're great sensors, and I would be very happy to see them everywhere. I think Pierre had a very important point. So one of the benefits, let's say, with more telecom techniques might be that you generate all the data at the shore side. So the data processing and data storage is inherently done on land. So you can really fully exploit the cable for information transmission. I'm personally not aware exactly what those trade-offs lies, but if you start putting down hundreds and hundreds of very sophisticated scientific sensors, I do imagine that you need some bandwidth to carry that information out.
Yeah, I think the smart cable people are just trying to promote an accelerometer, a pressure sensor, and a temperature sensor, and as just a very simple package. But so it's probably not a lot of bandwidth. But
yeah, I think the tricky thing would be to these repeaters are made for 25-year lifetimes, and it's a very rough environment down there. So many repeaters don't have any communication to the repeater at all. You just send a current, and that's it. In fact, I think most of them are changing to having zero communication. So having something inside that, you'd have to add a coupler and a optical transmitter, a lot of stuff that is that typically not in there currently. So I think it would be absolutely great to have these seismometers everywhere, super sensitive, but definitely a challenge to match those 25-year lifetimes and the price. Get them in that spatially constrained repeater. The subsea industry is also going towards this thing called SDM, spatial division multiplexing, where the number of fiber pairs is increasing drastically. So to get more capacity out of the same electrical power. And that means the space inside these repeaters is also going to be constrained. But dedicating a fiber for doing sensing in that case would be better. But having I'm not too familiar with the smart cable technology, but that'd be definitely a challenging undertaking with the repeater vendors.
One question that came to mind, just because this is kind of the marine geophysics side of the research coordination network, I know there's probably a lot of attendees tuning in that are of a more general audience, not necessarily ocean science. Are the SOP and phase type measurements, or the kind of description that Mikhail had, are those type of measurements applicable on land, or is it really just offshore that we can use these SOP and polarization type measurements?
I think that's a great question. The answer is they're definitely applicable on land. the trade-offs are slightly different. So the benefit of a submarine cable is that the ocean is very quiet. And most, I mean, there are fibers running, let's say, in a duct under a highway. And yes, the inherent noise floor from that is going to make sensing more challenging. So I think there's big difference depending on where you actually deploy the fiber on land. So because of the noise floor level. However, the sensors are very general, and some things are actually much easier. For example, if you look at interferometric measures using a laser, the big challenge for subsea is just the amount of decorrelation you have, because you have to propagate 10,000 or 15,000 kilometers. On land, that's much easier. So I think the same sensors are certainly applicable on land, and there are certain trade-offs depending on which one you use or how you use it that might make even better results on land or on ocean, depending on how you tweak them. But the general principle definitely applies to land-based network as well.
There's a question in the Q&A. Since hazard studies are important, national security is important, how did the Japanese work out of those issues for, like, amplify those issues for offshore cable studies?
Well, I think the Japanese have a bigger offshore hazard than the Pacific Northwest, and they just invested lots of money in deploying dedicated cables for basically monitoring both tsunamis and earthquakes offshore.
And another question came up. Do you see that the repeaters are to be modified to be compatible for sensing applications, i.e. backscatter sensing?
Yeah, maybe that question goes to Pierre, kind of. Like, is there a chance that these repeaters would be enhanced in a way, expanding the Bragg grading or modifying them in some way?
Yeah, certainly the Bragg ratings are very handy to have a nice high reflection at a limited frequency range. Now, enhancing the backscattering to get something like FAS to go through repeaters, that would be a challenge, because you don't want to impact the traffic, the communication traffic in any way. And so the VOA, the attenuator that I mentioned that's in the repeater, that's there very specifically to not to limit the backscattering. And if you remove that, then you'll get interference with communication channels. So, but there are if you I believe you can put in the fiber certain similar types of things. There were talks about that. I'm not too familiar with, but so mixing adjustments to a fiber pair or something to add reflections at certain wavelengths. So yeah, using the spectrum to isolate a certain part of it with enhanced reflections, and merging that with the repeater's ability to pass through those, maybe limit that attenuator to not cover that wavelength region. That would certainly help significantly, because it's even COTDR, with those COTDR techniques that measure the point losses in these fibers, they take an extraordinary high power, so they're not typically compatible with having live communication traffic and debugging a fiber for those point loss failures with COTDR. And even with those high powers, it takes hours of averaging to get the very low ends of, right now by the next to a repeater after the amplifier, there's high power, but as it propagates down, you need a significant amount of averaging to get a clean signal to really locate a little kink in the power versus distance, reflected power versus distance. So yeah, definitely that'd be a great thing. But I think mixing both repeater and the fiber technologies and using the wavelength as an isolation.
On the, I guess, well, we have Leah and William on, like the whale noise is absolutely fantastic and so interesting. And the thought that we could even be using that to study the planet is really interesting, or the water column. So I guess one of my questions is like, from the bioacoustics, William, you said you were in the marine mammal conference. What is the kind of, can you report back to this group about what you're hearing from those communities? I mean, what's the pickup of this in those communities?
Well, Leah was there too, so maybe she can comment first.
Sure. Well, so yeah, that was a conference that was a couple of weeks ago, and well, the first in a very long time. So that was actually the first time we got a chance to talk to people about this. And there was, I believe, a lot of excitement. We had a very special own session with the two of us presenting DAS. So I think that was actually kind of a very good clue in what direction the community thinks. And basically, well, most of the questions are about the quality of the data, because, well, we usually use data, not always from calibrated hydrophones, but one of the lower end goals are, for example, density estimation, where source level are quite important, where we need to have very good characterization of the detection range of our systems. And so this question was one of the one that was coming, I would say, all the time. The second was the sampling frequency. Can we go higher? Which we had elements of answers, but not fully as well, because, well, we know it depends on the length of the cable, what type of sampling frequency we can use. But also, so far, except from William's experiment that I'm looking forward to dig into the data, we don't know. I don't think we know really well how is the sensitivity behaving at higher frequencies. So are we going to receive pulses at 500 hertz as well as we do at 20 hertz? This I didn't have an answer to. So I think these are the questions that the community is quite eager to have answers for, but I would say there is a very high global interest.
There's a lot of interest in, both Leah and I have used just conventional ocean bottom seismometers to study whales, but there's always a frustration it's limited to a couple of hundred hertz, which is fin blue whales and a couple of other species. And if you could get it up to 1,000 hertz, then you could basically see all the baleen whales plus probably sperm whales. And that would generate a lot of interest, because the Navy that funds a lot of this work, they really want to know everything that's out there, not just a couple of species. And if it can go higher to even higher frequencies, maybe with short specialized cables, then that would be even better, right? Start getting killer whales at 10 kilohertz and all kinds of animals at 100 kilohertz. So, but I think
there's some sort of crab, that makes like a clicking sound. I'm really interested when we can hear that.
Yeah, and the fish, there may be fish sound. There are low frequency fish sounds, so that's another thing.
Fish bumps.
Yeah. Well, no, actually, fish swim bladders, they make sounds with their swim bladders at low frequency. So that's another thing that may be detected by this. But this conference is called the Detection, Classification, and Localization and Density Estimation of Marine Mammals. And so it's a very, very specialized conference. And every conference, they have a data set that they put out there, which people are meant to play with. And the next meeting's in Europe in a couple of years. But there was a comment at the end that maybe it will be a DAS data set in 4 years' time. So I think there's potentially a lot of interest in this. So it was kind of cool. It was exciting.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Cool. Well, I guess we're probably gonna wrap up at this stage. This has been a really great, several hours. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thanks to Meagan co-moderating, and thanks to Iris for kind of hosting the DAS RCN, hosting us here in this virtual space. So I'm going to turn it back to Justin, I guess. Is that correct, Justin? You there?
Yeah, that's right. So
cool.
Thank you. Thanks again to all of our panelists and speakers today. Really appreciate that. I do want to put a quick message in the chat here for people to have with some links in case you're interested in signing up for any of the DAS mailing listings, or would like to check out our website to see information about past and future events. But yeah, a special thanks to Nate and Meagan as well for moderating, and as well as our presenters. The recording of today's presentations will be made available on the IRIS Earthquake Science webinar playlist. So if you just go to YouTube and do a search for IRIS earthquake, you should be able to pull that right up. If you're interested in future DAS webinars, please join the DAS mailing list. I just put the link in the chat, and I also added the link for the DAS RCN website, so you can find out more there too. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. See you later.